We have never seen anything like the presidency of Donald Trump, but don't take that from me. Take it from presidential historian Jon Meacham, who has studied the history of the American presidency much more closely than I have. This is what he said this morning on Morning Joe.
This is an existential constitutional crisis because it's quite possible that the President of the United States right now is a witting, or at least partially witting, agent of a foreign power.
But in the face of this existential constitutional crisis, Nancy Pelosi has put out the word to the House, in the House of Representatives, to the Democrats, that she does not want Democrats talking about impeachment, or at least insisting that no consideration of impeachment can be allowed until Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller has finished his investigation. And that is exactly how the Clinton impeachment happened. The House Judiciary Committee began impeachment hearings on President Bill Clinton only after Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr completed his 4-year investigation of the president. Bill Clinton was then impeached by the House of Representatives, but acquitted in a trial in the United States Senate by his jury of United States senators, with 45 senators voting yes to convict and remove Bill Clinton from office, and 55 senators voting no on one article of impeachment. And on the second article of impeachment, the vote was 50-50. But during the rampant corruption of the Nixon administration, Congress did not wait for the special prosecutor. President Nixon was the subject of a special prosecutor's investigation at the very same time that he was being investigated by Congress. And the House Judiciary Committee began impeachment hearings before the special prosecutor completed his investigation. And the House Judiciary Committee actually voted to approve 3 articles of impeachment against President Nixon while the special prosecutor was still working on the case. And it was that vote by the House Judiciary Committee that ultimately forced President Nixon to resign when Republican senators went to the White House to tell him that he would indeed be impeached by the full House of Representatives, and then he would be convicted and removed from office in a trial in the Senate by the required 2/3 vote in the United States Senate. So what is the best approach for House Democrats next year in handling the case against Donald Trump? To answer that, we'll turn to presidential historian Jon Meacham, who joins us next. Here is a bit of the existential constitutional crisis that Jon Meacham was referring to in the Trump presidency.
Did you want President Trump to win the election, and did you direct any of your officials to help him do that?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Because he talked about bringing the U.S.-Russia relationship back to normal.
Joining us now, Jon Meacham, presidential historian and an MSNBC contributor. John, I was really struck by your words this morning, and the crisis seems to be ever more crisis-filled as we go through these days. Today, we have a federal judge telling the court that Michael Flynn sold out his country as national security advisor for Donald Trump. We've never been in a place like this. What would your advice be to Democrats in the House of Representatives about how they should handle their powers next year in relation to what they're seeing in what you call this existential constitutional crisis?
Part of what they need to see, obviously, is all of Director Mueller's report in the fullness of time. In a way, the first 3 great impeachment efforts are instructive but not dispositive. So at the risk of self-parody, let's start in 1865. The Republicans tried to get Andrew Johnson before 1865 was out. They opened hearings in the House trying to find reasons to remove him from office. Ultimately, it failed by a very narrow margin in the Senate. But they were really after him because he was trying to undo the implications of the verdict of the Civil War. Cut to Nixon. So Andrew Johnson was about politics. Nixon, the reason he had to resign was they had him on tape. There was clear evidence of obstruction of justice. He was ordering one federal agency to stop another federal agency, and we forget this, and we may end up with another element in this crisis. Nixon followed the rule of law. When the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 in July of 1974 that he had to hand everything over, he did, in fact, hand everything over. So he left after, as you alluded to it a moment ago, Barry Goldwater went down and said, you don't have more than a dozen votes, and I don't think I'm one of them, Mr. President, which really brought that home to Nixon. Then with Clinton, you had a question of proportionality. Pretty clear what happened, but basically the country and the institutions decided it wasn't worth undoing an election over that. Here we are now with something that goes all the way back to a nightmare of the founders coming true. And I think what I would recommend to House Democrats and Republicans would be to go read Federalist 22, which was Alexander Hamilton talking about the nefarious and pernicious possibility of foreign corruption on the new Republican, lowercase r, government. There's a reason we have a clause in the Constitution that says you can't accept titles of nobility. You can't grant titles of nobility. You can't accept gifts from foreign powers unless you have the congressional approval. They were incredibly worried in the 1780s and 90s that the Republican experiment would fall prey to exactly the kind of thing that Vladimir Putin, 2.5 centuries on, is doing. He's running a campaign to destabilize the government. And the question is, and I think we'll have to see from Director Mueller, to what extent was candidate Trump and President Trump a knowing part of that conspiracy, or to what extent did that conspiracy has it affected what he does? Those are the questions that, depending on the answers to them, I think we could be in a very dramatic place very quickly.
And so is this a case where it seems that the reasonable approach is, as in the Clinton case, wait for the special prosecutor to finish his work? Congress did not wait for the special prosecutor to finish the work in the Nixon case.
That's true, but you also had the evidence emerging. Remember, it was a little different. You had the tape. You had the, what was it, the June 21st tape, yes, which was the smoking gun. So there was more explicit evidence there. It may be that Congress has something that, as a layman, I don't know about, but ultimately, I think it's pretty clear already. You have him, I think, as effectively an unindicted co-conspirator, although we should point out, as you know, it's not impossible that President Trump gets indicted secretly, and Mueller waits out the term, and then they open it, and then they test the guidance on whether you can do that. But I think on the Russia question, which to me is the most pernicious, the most destabilizing, I think we have to know a little bit more. And once we know that, then I think the House will have a duty to move, seems to me.
Jon Meacham, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.